Hi guys. From today, I start a discussion on Chanakya's book Arthashastra. And first of all, there are three basic translations of Arthashastra. The first two were done in the early 1900s when this was rediscovered. Everyone had heard of Arthashastra, but in other texts, but no one actually knew where the Arthashastra is until scholar, I think, what was his name? Yeah, Shastri. He discovered this text. He was a librarian in South India. I don't know exactly where, probably Tamil Nadu. He was randomly going through some old texts on leaves, and they were written in Sanskrit and old ancient languages, and he was reading them, and he thought that, wait, this sounds like Arthashastra. And then he went through all of them and compiled them. He was the first to translate, and then another translation happened by R.P. Kangal. So both of these translations have one problem, which is a problem with most English translations of Sanskrit texts, is that they are almost impossible to understand and read because the sentence construction has no relation to modern English. So a retired IFS officer, Mr. Ellen Rangarajan, translated this version in the 1990s, and he has given a huge introduction section, essentially explaining and justifying, because he is a very humble man, that his dedication of the book is to the first two people who translated it, but then he explains why I needed to translate it again, and then he gives some basic gist that how you need to go about reading the book, because there's an issue about appendices. Every section, almost everything we discuss will be mentioned that it will be later discussed in that appendix or in that other section, so we'll have to read the entire book for that. So remember that. So I'm not reading that introductory section. I'm starting from the core Arthashastra itself, and his commentaries on it are also added. So in this video, we'll go through the small introduction about the discussion on Kautilyan state and society. He writes, Ellen Rangarajan writes, the scope of this chapter is limited to two purposes. Firstly, to set the stage for a better understanding of the translation, and secondly, to enable the readers to trace the verses in this translation dealing with a specific subject, especially those not usually found in other studies. In this sense, it is more a roadmap than a comprehensive commentary. The aim is neither to provide a detailed summary of the text as a whole, nor to make a comparison of Kautilya's views with those in the Dharmashastras, Niti Shastras, or other texts. For such comparative studies, the reader is referred to the works listed in the bibliography. Kangal, R.P. Kangal, who is the second person to translate it, Kangal's book called Study is particularly recommended. In the various parts of this translation, all verses concerning topics such as the king, the administrative structure, budget and accounts, law and justice, foreign policy or war have been brought together. Hence, the following description of the Kautilyan state and society covers only those aspects which straddle different parts. The explanatory introductions to each part supplemented this chapter. Since foreign policy is not touched upon in this chapter, the attention of the reader is particularly invited to the introduction to part 10, which we'll get to in future videos. In order to understand better the nature of the kingdoms in the Arthashastra, the first section of this chapter contains a brief description of the natural features of an imaginary Kautilyan country. Imaginary because this book is essentially a recommendation of a hypothetical Kautilyan state, that this is what would be best. This is what is the ideal. Try and implement these things. This book, Arthashastra, is essentially a manual for kings. Kautilyan society is covered in the next section, starting with the structure of the society and the complex varna and the outcaste system. It is also important to note aspects of the daily life of the people, particularly how they lived in the towns and villages, what they ate and drank, how they spent their leisure, and what part religion played in their lives. Since the status of women in Kautilyan society is a topic which has been somewhat neglected in the studies on the Arthashastra, the last subsection brings together all the major areas dealing with women, including their livelihood and their rights. Though economics is an important part of the Arthashastra, it is difficult to form a clear idea of the economic system, since Kautilya's ordering of topics is so different, because the nature of language, how literature works, all changes in a few years, because I find so hard to understand the English written by Indians in the 1900s when they translated the Arthashastra. So obviously the concept of language, our sentence construction, our thought processes 2300 years ago would be very different. The relative and therefore the ordering of things, how Chanakya arranged his chapters is very different from how we are used to reading things today. The relative importance between state and private economic activities, land use, agriculture in its technical as well as revenue aspects, animal husbandry, mining and manufacturing, labor and employment, and trade are covered in the third section. I have stressed in the introduction how Kautilya's repeated emphasis on welfare has been ignored or misinterpreted. Kautilya's repeated emphasis on welfare, because welfare according to Kautilya is not the welfare socialist state, the Ashokan nanny state that we understand today. That's not what Kautilya means by welfare, and that's not what the translator means when he writes the word welfare. You need to remember that when we read the book in future. The last section is therefore devoted to a compilation of the verses on welfare of the people and animal welfare. I reiterate that the verses are mentioned here only as references, and that every verse is relating to a topic is not listed here. While for the sake of readability, a brief indication of the general tenor of the verses is given, the actual translation will need to be consulted to find out what exactly Kautilya said. The location of any verse can be ascertained from the verse index.